Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's Xtalks webinar. Today's talk is entitled The Changing Landscape of Decentralized Clinical Trials. My name is Ryan Muse, and I'll be your Xtalks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speaker. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speaker throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this same chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank MRN, who developed the content for this presentation. MRN's focus is supporting clinical research delivery by helping patients participate in trials while remaining in their communities wherever they live around the world. They aim to reduce the inconvenience and disruption of visits to investigator sites as much as feasible by reducing the number of those visits. MRN enhances patient enrollment, recruitment, and retention. Increased patient centricity is changing clinical research. This is, and always will be, a core part of Medical Research Network's DNA. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker for today's event. Stuart has over 25 years in the clinical research sector, having worked for a number of sponsors and CROs before joining MRN. Stuart's experience spans many disciplines, including data management, clinical operations, project management, business development, proposals and budgets, and marketing. Stuart was one of the MRN founders in 2006, joining the organization as head of project management. In 2009, Stuart took on the role of Vice President of Global Business Development and Marketing before stepping up as Chief Operating Officer in 2017. Stuart is always focused on maximizing performance, improving processes, and promoting high-quality decentralized approaches. Now, before we continue today, we have a poll question that we'd like our audience members to interact with. You can select either of the two options you see in front of you and then click submit. And the question that we have for you is, as you see, have you ever used a decentralized trial model? Your answers are simply yes or no. We appreciate you taking the time to think about this and, of course, submit your answer. We greatly appreciate it. The question, again, is, have you ever used a decentralized trial model? It looks like most of you have submitted a vote, so thank you again for participating. Let's see where your answers have come down on. It looks like 64% of you have said no, but 36% have said yes. It's very interesting. Thank you again. So before, though, we continue even further, we've got another follow-up question then. So for those of you who have said yes, we're curious to know what types you have used. Your answer options are fully virtual, wearable device focused, hybrid virtual, or mobile nursing, or telehealth. The question is, which of the following types of DCT have you used? We thank you for joining us today. We're going in for quite a treat with our speaker today and the discussion he's going to present to you. But we do appreciate you taking the time right now to consider an answer as it applies to yourself or the company that you work at and participate. We'll give you just a few more seconds to get an answer in. It looks like most of you have voted. Let's take a look at where those results have come down. Here we are, 43% for fully virtual, 14% for both hybrid virtual and telehealth, and then 29% on mobile nursing. All right, well, thank you once again for your time and participation in this. Let's now, without further ado, hand it over to Stuart to begin our presentation. Stuart Redding, you may begin when you're ready.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction and for running the poll questions. I think that was very interesting. So, as you heard, my name's Stuart Redding. I'm Chief Operating Officer at the MRN. I was one of the founders of MRN 15 years ago, stepping out of over 10 years of working within clinical operations, project management, etc., in the clinical trials environment, both pharma and CRO. So, I found the MRN concept when I joined of being able to send nurses out to see patients in the home quite a a refreshing change from the kind of a trial mill of working in a CRO, and all of the challenges that faced. So we were selling a completely new concept at the very beginning, and so it's quite enlightening to be sitting here 15 years later, talking about decentralized clinical trials, and perhaps sitting here wondering what we really mean by decentralized clinical trials. And some of you may also be thinking, 64% of you in the poll have never used these types of models and approaches, and they are or can be perceived as quite new in the environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do, and how I perceive the clinical trial environment and the decentralized trial environment, and how we could better do that. I always struggle with these opening slides on presentations, because it's you're trying to set a scene before you get into the meat of your conversation. So I sat here earlier staring at this slide, thinking, what am I looking at here? As you probably all are too. And it's quite apparent again. Well, as a doctor, as a physician, clearly talking to a patient, might be a clinical trial, might not be a clinical trial through a telehealth platform. You may be wondering, I wonder what telehealth platform they're using. You may be thinking, oh, that's mine. You might be thinking that's a nice iPad. But actually, when we started delivering visits in the home, when we started delivering decentralized clinical trials, if I'd showed you that slide 15 years ago, all you'd be thinking is, that's the funniest looking laptop I've ever seen. Where's the keyboard? Because nobody knew what an iPad was, right? iPads didn't come out till about 11 years ago, 2010. So we've been delivering decentralized clinical trial visits for 5 years by the time that the iPad even arrived. In fact, we were founded in the Nokia nation. iPhones didn't come out till a year later. So the technology around us, let alone in clinical trials, has moved forward, absolute leaps and bounds in the time that we've been delivering these decentralized models. So I'm going to start here by just pointing out, decentralized clinical trials are not new. Seeing patients in the home, we've been doing for 15 years. We're not the only people that have been doing it for that long. And I think and there were other things happening in the home even before that. So it's not a new concept. When we went out talking to customers and said, we could take your protocol defined visits and do them in the home, decrease the burden on the patient, get your patients into the projects quicker. Nobody believed it was possible. There was questions around, well, how do you maintain PI oversight and regulatory compliance and delegation and adherence to GCP and all those other things that I'm sure everybody's buzzing around everybody's head still today. We had answers and addressed all of those, but it was an absolutely new concept. So we only ever really got pulled into emergency situations, rescue studies where patients just didn't want to enroll in the clinical trial. Whereas today, I think we're in a much more proactive state. I think the industry's been moving in this direction for at least the last 5 years under the kind of acceleration of technology, but probably for 10 years from the just changing perception of how to deliver things. And actually, as I go through this, I think the founding principle from my perspective has got to be the patient, and the patient as a customer and as a person, and what patients want, which of course translates into what we all want and what we all expect in this ever-changing world. We're not in the Nokia environment anymore. We're here with iPads and iPhones in our hands, expecting a lot more. If we want to buy anything that our heart desires right now, most of us locked in isolation due to the pandemic, we go onto Amazon, we order it, we get it tomorrow, and we start to expect that level of service and performance. So that the whole expectation setting, everybody's lives is changing, and therefore the way that we have to deliver healthcare and clinical trials has to change with it. So there's been a bit of a journey. So we didn't talk about decentralized trials 15 years ago. We talked about what we would call home trial support visits, which is the nursing visit to the patient's home to do a protocol defined visit there as opposed to at site. That's probably a fairly good definition for decentralized trial today, but nobody thought about doing it. It was absolutely new and novel. The traditional model is what everybody was used to doing, and the clinical trials industry being fairly conservative in its development, as we all know, has been slow to move away from traditional, and the fact that we still have 64% of the poll today not having done anything around decentralized clinical trials shows that we're still in that position predominantly. The pandemic over the last 12 months has pushed people very rapidly into the community-based model. How do we get out to the patients if the patients can't come to the sites? And that's been an almighty shove in one direction of something that was already moving. So I'm going to talk about the traditional models and what works and what was good and what was bad about those, and how we should move away from those, or at least look at a hybrid of those. We can touch on the virtual models. The virtual model has been around. Again, some of you have done fully virtual clinical trials. They were kicked off in about 2011 when Pfizer ran their first virtual model, which was well ahead of its time in terms of technology and acceptance. But I think there is a place for some of that, some of those types of approaches today. And I'll talk about decentralized trials. On the left there, you've got community models. We talk a lot about community models. We talk a lot about hybrid trials. They all kind of sit in with that decentralized brand, as it were. Everybody talks about patient centricity. Quite often, people talk about patient centricity, but they don't really know what it means. And the patient centricity is not giving patients something that you think they want. I think patient centricity has to be about giving the patients what they want as individuals, and what may suit me won't suit somebody else, and it may not suit me next week either. So there's got to be that choice and the kind of the user experience, as it were, from a patient's perspective. So let's get into a bit more detail around these models. So traditional trial models are very much built around the site. So the structure would always be, as a CRO or a pharma, you would go out and you would select the sites to do that particular project, and that will be based on finding people that work in those areas, finding people that have the patients of the right database, can demonstrate that proven history, your key opinion leaders, your big prescribers, wherever you're directed from a marketing perspective, disease prevalence, all those kind of things go into the mix of where you put those sites. But sites deliver really well on one project and then really badly on the next one, and I think everybody gets surprised by that. But every clinical trial is subtly different. Different workloads, different staff, different patients, all have an impact on how sites perform. Even working with different CROs could put sites in different places and change the way that patient recruitment happens. So there's very little control over how that patient recruitment happens. You're very much reliant on the site delivering, and you're very much reliant on the patient wanting to participate. I read somewhere that about 70% of patients live greater than 2 hours travel away from the trial site. And that's a big ask if you have to go into the site for a visit on a regular basis. So if you've got a weekly visit and you've got a 2 hour visit, it takes you 2 hours to get there and 2 hours to get home. That's wiped out most of your day, and that's a significant weight to going into the clinical trial, especially if you have mobility issues or children or a job, all of those other things that make that even harder to do. So the site model is got to be reliant on a site that are capable of delivering that particular protocol with that patient type, with the right staffing and throughput to get patients into that study, with a large enough patient population that are willing to travel on a regular basis to each of the visits and to stay in the trial. We know that doesn't work. We know 11% of sites fail to recruit a single patient. That's not a disaster because you can close them down and move on, but it's cost you a lot of money. And if it costs you, I don't know, £35,000 to set up the site, and you end up closing 10 of those, that's a big chunk of money that's just been wasted. And worse still, if they put in one patient, you've still got to look after them and monitor them and track them, etc., etc. And you end up with a large number of sites and a fairly poor data quality. And if 37% of sites under enroll, not a surprising statistic. 48% trials miss their enrollment targets. I think as an industry, we're very much accepting of not hitting the target. We start off with a certain target, we end up moving it, we move it again, and eventually we hit it. It might have taken us a year longer than we planned to in the first place, and everybody celebrates that it's been completed. It's an odd environment. And we need to look at things differently to get away from that. Retention is poor. 25% of patients drop out of clinical trials. Patients are well educated in this new world. Patients are on the internet. They're looking at options. If they're not feeling the benefit and they know there's something else, they're going to want to move on, or they're going to want to move on to a marketed product which drops their visit load. And every time a patient drops out, of course, you're losing that data. It's cost you money. You need to over-enroll to get to the endpoints, etc. The sites can only recruit from a narrow geographical reach. So you've already limited your patient population by giving them a physical location to go to. You limit diversity because you're only going to be sitting local to that site, and that really depends on where the site is landed, and that depends on the experience and the previous trial work, etc., that's happened. And it's expensive. You need a lot of sites with that low throughput to be able to deliver your clinical trial. So, and it'll take you a long time to do it. So, all in all, the industry still works to this model predominantly. But there needs to be a step away from it to something that's new and can evolve with everybody's expectations and lifestyle. So virtual models are very much more data centric. So they're driven by the technology. And if you go to a fully virtual platform, you will be sitting with no real site. You may have one central PI. With patients that you're relying on finding the clinical trial through the internet, through disease groups, through advertising, outreach, social media, etc. And the patients have to have a desire to want to participate. They have to be able to understand it. They have to be able to enroll in it. They need to have that self-motivation to be able to get into the project and to run with autonomy, but and independence, but on their own. So it lacks care. The healthcare, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Touchy-feely interaction is gone in a fully virtual model. And I think we're probably all feeling like we need more social interaction right now, given the fact that we've all been living in varying degrees of isolation for the last 12 months within the pandemic. Maybe we know a bit. We're starting to understand how this virtual model could feel when everything is being done at arm's length. Patients have to remain motivated, and that's difficult because you may not be getting much feedback from a fully virtual model, and it's very easy to pick up and it's very easy to put down again because you could lose enthusiasm pretty quickly. So I've put a certain amount of data into the internet. I'm not being told anything. I've taken 2 of these tablets and I've kind of forgotten about it. You move on to the next thing. You're very limited in types of projects you could do in this model. You've got that limited hands-on physician or nurse interaction. Presents you with a level of safety risk because you're not being able to assess the patient's hands-on. You may get a lot of data, but you're not necessarily seeing them and touching them, as it were. You're losing the experience of the prescribers and the medics that are out in the field. So you're looking at kind of low intervention, very late phase, high volume, safe types of projects. There's certain therapy areas you can't touch because certain types of patients won't be able to do the study. They won't be able to handle the technology and to be able to enter the data to do the self-reporting. And you introduce a different set of diversity because you widen the geography, but you then narrow down the population based on their ability to be able to work in that environment. So again, you've got to be looking at a therapy area and the patient demographic. Are they fluent in using the internet? Are they going to be trustworthy of the data? Do they understand how the security works, etc. And I think a lot of people would say, well, this is a decentralized clinical trial. This is what decentralized clinical trials are. It falls under that banner, but I think it's a different approach. And for me, the ideal, the sweet spot of a decentralized trial is where you've got that hybrid model of patient choice, reducing patient burden, but actually giving the patients the care that they need, which is where I think the decentralized model is the winner. And this is how we see it in MRN world. This is how we've been operating for the last 15 years. The technology is new to the party, but I think that adds to what you can offer the patients. It adds to the data quality. It adds to the numbers of visits you can do in a home, and I think that's all positive. But what you maintain, you're trying to maintain a suitable level of care. So you don't need to get rid of the sites. You keep the sites. You keep the PIs. You keep the PI oversight. You may not need as many because you can recruit from much further afield, and you may want to use online enrollment techniques and social media and outreach, etc., to raise awareness with patients, because the sites don't have to recruit them from such a local location, because you can see them in the home. So if the patient has to travel 4 hours to a site, but then you have to do it every 3 months, that's much more manageable than doing it every 2 weeks. So you immediately open the door to a much wider number of patients. You can go out and see patients at home. You can go out and see patients at work. You can go out and see patients at school. It fits in with the patient's lives and how they want to work. So the patients may be recording data independently. They may be wearing a device that's recording data. They may have some sensors in the home that the nurses can help set up for them. You've got the technology. You're deploying the technology, but you're deploying it with a care package of the nursing support and the IMP arriving at the patient's home with the nurse. It's all taken care of. The patient doesn't have to do anything apart from be at home at the point in time when the visit's going to happen, to be able to open the door and let the work let the nurse in to do the visit, to do the work. So sites are still important, but you run with less. It allows them to reach to run outreach. It allows them to work with referral networks, collaborative sites, using their databases, but getting the patients on board through traditional consent models, and then they choose whether they want to be seen in the home environment. They don't have to. Some patients like to be seen on site early on in a project, and then to drift out to more visits in the home later when they're feeling more comfortable. Others vice versa. You'll have different levels of uptake based on country. You will get different levels of uptake based on therapy area and demographic. So quite often, if we're asked, well, what's the ideal type of trial for implementing a home visit mobile nursing service, and that's a really difficult one to answer, because you could say, well, it could be the elderly population because it's harder for them to get into the site, but it may be that they don't have as much going on in their lives, and actually going out to the site is something they enjoy and they look forward to, and it's all part of the event, and they like that because they like the attention and they like the care that they get when they do that. If you've got mobility issues, it becomes more difficult, and maybe you would lean towards the visit. If it's pediatrics, again, it's time, it's school, it's work. It's appealing to be able to do that in the home environment. The flip side for the parents is, well, do I want the clinical trial and that clinical setting coming into my home, or is that a safe space and I'd rather go to the site? There is no right answer for anyone. And even personally, when I look at if I was to go into a clinical trial, would I jump on the chance of being seen at home? Well, in some scenarios, probably. In other scenarios, probably not. If it's a lengthy IMP infusion for me in the home, wouldn't work. A quick blood draw would. And sometimes you want to just be able to go to the site and put the clinical trial in a box and pretend it's not happening. And that's great. So if you're increasing your geographical reach, you can increase your diversity. You get a higher throughput of patients per site, which gives you much better data quality, and actually will drive your site setup cost down. So whilst the cost of moving visits out into the home environment is higher at a per visit level, because you're paying for more nurse time because they're traveling as opposed to being sitting at the site waiting for the patient to do the traveling, you're kind of flicking around your costs. So less sites, less setup costs, slightly more weighted to the visit costs, but your ongoing management costs should stabilize because you're potentially going to deliver the projects and the patients and the recruitment on time. You're less likely to have a big overrun in your recruitment. You can deploy the technology, but you're deploying it in a managed and supported way. So putting a load of technology and gadgets in a box and sending the patient home with them doesn't really work, because they've got to set them all up, and it's just it's presenting confusion and difficult. But to somebody to come out and to help them with that, and to be deploying the right technology for the right reason in the right indication and population, take some considered thought to get it right. You're giving the patients a better experience. They're more likely to want to stay in a clinical trial. It's hard to drop out of something that's just coming to your door because you go, well, it's kind of working, so why would I feel like I wanted to stop? It's not interrupting my life. I'm in a routine. It works. So the retention rates. We've demonstrated incredibly high retention rates across a lot of the work we do, and proven increased recruitment rates. So again, you're getting that performance, less sites, higher throughput, faster delivery, to give you that cost neutrality. But ultimately, it's the patient choice. It's your clinical trial. You have it how you want to do it. So you're creating an infrastructure. It has to have a certain roadmap. It has to have some level of consistency for planning purposes. But you're giving patients the option. It's the patient centricity piece here that I think is absolutely critical. And the technology can't be the answer to everything. The technology can be supportive, but people still want to have the healthcare that they enter a clinical trial for. To get it right, keys for success. I try to split these up into a number of categories: study design, IMP, patients, technology, recruitment, and countries and sites. So I'll talk through each of these individually. From a study design perspective, the keys to having the right design is thinking about it from the very onset. You can't bolt decentralized models, home visits, technology onto an already written protocol. You can, but you're going to get limited value out of it. So you got to think about, well, what is the visit structure going to look like? How often do I really need to see these patients? What assessments have to happen? And when do they need to be seen by a physician, or when can they be seen by a nurse? So if I can get that right, so if I need to see the patients every 2 weeks because that's when they get dosed, but we could dose them in the home, that could be done by a nurse. And if I need to do a full physical exam or a scan or something, we can't travel out. Could we bring all those things together once every 3 months, once every 2 months, and do those visits in the site? Can I then put all of those other interim visits into the home environment? So I get the right, I'm getting the right balance of being able to put as much as I can into the home to give the patient the accessibility, but with enough touch points with the physician to get the assessments I want to do, to get that right. And if I can match that against what's commercially available, then for the patient it's a like decision. I'm going to have to go and see the physician every 2 or 3 months anyway. So if I go into the trial or if I go into the commercially available product, it's the same thing. The other bits just are going to happen in the interim at my own leisure. You need to look at the lengths of the visits. We were always, as long as I can remember, we run clinical trials where everybody just adds more and more and more assessments to the visits. And you go, well, the patient's coming to the site for 4 hours now. I mean, did all these things really need to be done? Or have we moved away from what we're trying to achieve in this clinical trial? So it's the same concept has to happen. It's like, well, what do you need to put into these visits when they're on site, and what can we do in the home? And how do those home visits look? How long are they? What's the burden going to be on the patient? What's the invasion into their privacy going to look like? And let's get that right. And what are we going to do with what is the how do we handle the locations for patients? What is it going to? What's the disease prevalence look like? What is the traveling going to look like? How important is it to weight it to the community versus to the site? If it's a very prevalent indication and you're going to be working in built-up areas, most patients may be quite local, so it may be less of an issue. There may be, in a rare diseases perspective, we've got patients are going to be living in considerable distances away, so therefore putting the more you can put out to the community, the better, to keep them or to be able to get them onto the trial and keep them engaged in the trial. And standard of care, as I said, if you can match a trial to the standard of care, the marketed products, then patients are comparing like for like. From an IMP perspective, obviously, you've got to have safety data. We won't do any clinical trials early phase without enough safety data to know that if we're going to go out and administer IMP to a patient in the home, that it's safe. And we need to know how we're going to administer it, because there's we can do injections and infusions, and we can reconstitute in the home. All of our IMPs, whether they're reconstituted in the pharmacy or in the home, will be transported out to the nurse using a premium courier. You've got to look at the stability. How stable is the product once it's made up? Can we move it? What's the temperature going to look like? How far does it have to travel? So those are the decisions around, well, do we reconstitute in the home? Do we reconstitute in the pharmacy? Do we need a pharmacy local to the patient? Do we use a central pharmacy? There's a lot of questions around getting the IMP right. Do you send it home with the patient? Is it a pre-filled syringe, etc.? And how are you going to do that? How are you going to manage those logistics and build that into the whole package? Make sure you've got all of the IMP in the right place to be able to deploy it to all these different scenarios. And then looking at the patients, what is the indication? What sort of care do they really need? What are they going to be able to handle? What are they really going to want? Going out to patient groups, getting a view from the people themselves of what would work for them. What's the demographic? Are they going to want more hands-on care? Are they going to want to come to the site? Are they not going to want to come to the site? Again, it goes back to the whole site and patient location piece, and around and also around the carers and the parents, depending on are patients going to be able to travel on their own, or do they need to be supported, accompanied, etc. And then the technology. What are you trying to put into the technology package? Don't put everything in. Think about what you're trying to achieve from a if it's a wearable, it might be easy to deploy if you're using sensors in the home or giving patients devices to record data. Let's make sure that it's usable and that they're going to be able to work with it. And then you've got help on hand when they need it, whether that's online help desk, phones, etc. Telehealth, I think, is a great new concept. It's growing rapidly. From our perspective, it's a way of expanding the visits that we can do in the home, because obviously we can bring a physician into the home along with our nurse through that virtual platform to be able to do assessments that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to do. So I think that's invaluable, and leaving that with the patient to be able to have interim visits again adds to the whole package. And then just generally all of that. How do you bring all of that e-source together and make that work in the trial? Because it's got to be seamless at the back as well as the front end for the patient. Recruitment, where are you going to do it? Are you predominantly going to be recruiting out of sites, or is it a patient population indication that you could push out to the internet, to outreach, social media? Where are you going to find them, and how's that going to work? How do you support the sites to be able to get them in and through? And then where are you going to do it? What countries are you going to do it? What sites are you going to do it in? What countries can you do it in? We can't. If we're looking to offer an at-home service, we can't operate everywhere on the globe. We can operate in a lot of regions, but not everywhere. So you can't give it to everybody. But you want to get it out to as many people as possible. Where are you driven from a country perspective? What regulations limit you? So, for example, we can go out and do simple blood draws in most countries that we operate in, but you can't necessarily administer IMP in pediatrics in every country, or you can only do it under certain conditions with certain products, and you may have to deploy physicians and not nurses. So there's complexities to look at and work through when you're trying to work out where to go. You need to pick up all of your key opinion leaders, and where does your marketing and sales team push the use of the trials? Who do you really want to have on board? Who do you need to have on board? And then how do you construct your patient information sheet and your consent forms to be able to educate the patients to be able to make the right decision? And then we need to educate the sites and the PIs over what that messaging is to the patient and how to roll it out appropriately. So there's many things to consider through the study design and the IMP phase. We're our ideal approach as an organisation is to be involved with customers early on to help with this study design phase. If we have a view of the sort of first pass visit structure, then we can consult and work with you around how you put that together to give you the best uptake, how we could bring technology into that from our side, things that we've got that we're working with, things that you may want to bring to the table. We can then look at what regions you want to go into, what regions we can map over, and how we're going to bridge that gap through the regulations and put together the right materials to get out to the sites and to the patients to make it as successful as possible. So are we looking at the new normal? Absolutely not. As you indicated by the poll earlier, 64% of you have never done anything with decentralized clinical trials. And actually, if you look at this data from Clinical Trials Europe last year, that's a survey of 184 people, so a bigger group. Less than 30% of the trials utilise DCT approaches. So a pretty similar story from that wider group. Nearly 80% reported an increase in utilisation of DCT methods driven by COVID. I think we would all agree that the beginning or the second quarter of last year, there was a scramble to move patients out of sites and to be able to continue recruiting and continue treating patients in clinical trials that were becoming disrupted because of the COVID pandemic, and sites were unable to take patients, unable to resource the visits for the patients. They didn't want the patients in the hospital. Patients didn't want to go to the hospital for obvious reasons. So we certainly got a lot of requests for new business around how do we pick up these patients quickly, or how do we add visits to studies we're already working on to be able to keep the patients' treatments ongoing. And now coming out of that, I think everybody wants to be future-proof for this happening again, or it has at least now been able to dip a toe in the water of saying, well, actually, this works. Actually, this is the future. This is delivering, and people like it. Patients like it. The sites like it, and it's working and delivering. Only 9% reported standard use of DCT approaches. That being a kind of standard, it is the approach that we use on everything. And again, that's really low. We need to see that start to increase. On the positive, 84% of people said they were looking to increase these approaches in their trials and within their organizations. As I say, I think everybody is looking to how they evolve. Still concerns over regulatory challenges for sure, and I think there's a lot of questions we get asked around regulations and GCP and all those kind of areas. The new normal is evolving. You've got things like the IMI Trials at Home initiative, which we're part of, and the DTRA, which we're part of, all looking at how do you do this stuff around decentralized trial. The DTRA specifically is coming together to try and create some standardization and some guidance and some support about how to deliver studies differently. And I think that's a great initiative that I think is gonna really drive forward the change in how we do our jobs. And having sat on some of their working group meetings, I think it's a really good mix of tech, of healthcare, of pharma, CRO. Everybody looking at these things from a slightly different approach, but actually trying to put together a package that works really well. And I think that sits in that kind of hybrid DCT type model that I described as how we are approaching it, how we operate, and is the way to do this. So just to touch a little on growth, this chart here on the left just shows how decentralized trial models were steadily growing over the period of 9-10 years pre-2020. So this data is it's probably an indication of how things are looking and not an absolute number. So this comes from a data search that really is just picking up free text around decentralized trial models. So it's more illustrative than anything else, but it does show that the trend in DCT models was definitely increasing up to the point of 2020. The yellow peak there is infectious disease COVID-19 studies, which shot up with everybody looking to try and get their COVID work through as fast as possible, as you'd expect last year, and other things taking a bit of a dip. But I think generally the trend is upwards. And again, on the chart on the top right there is showing that that the number of trials being conducted has been steadily increasing over the last 6 years. The pie chart's looking at the types of things that people are doing. So predominantly you've got web-based home visits, telemedicine growing, hybrid trials. It comes down to how you start to define the difference between hybrids and virtuals, etc. But again, it's just showing how the sector's steadily evolving. From an MRN perspective, going back to 2006, our numbers of visits that we're doing in the home has grown enormously. We've grown on about 30% a year since the beginning. 2020 was a high-paced year, and we saw slightly larger growth than we have in other years, but it wasn't as out of step as it felt, perhaps. And the sector has always been growing and will continue to grow. So, we've done well over 50,000 visits in the home now, so we've got a huge amount of experience in how to deploy these types of trial models and how to make them work across a variety of indications and patient types. So really, I'm just to summarize, decentralized trials as a name, as a brand, is pretty new. Decentralized trials as a concept isn't new. These things have been around for many years. They are going to stay. I say the initiatives are going to drive the standardization and I think bring all of the pharma companies into alignment around how best to deliver clinical trials, and that's going to grow within the sector. But the planning is critical. You've got to build it in up front. You've got to be thinking about it from the beginning. You can't bolt it on at the end. You've got to be realistic about the technology, and much as it's nice and new and shiny to want to try and add in everything you can, you need to think about, well, what do we really want? What really gives us the advantage here? What's going to be good for the patient, for the site? How do we want to collect this data? What's going to be the more robust data sets? There's a lot of things out there that are useful. There's a lot of things out there that aren't. I think we're all tempted by the new and the shiny, but very quickly work out that there's a lot of things we don't use. We don't use half the functionality of our Outlook calendars. We don't use half the functionality of our iPhones. It's all there. We want it, but we don't use it. So we need to think about our clinical trials in the same way. Patient centricity is all about giving patients care and choice, and being able to go about the treatment how they want to do it. But we've got to remember we need to be giving them healthcare at the end of the day. People are becoming more demanding. We know we can order something on Amazon now and it'll be in our hands this time tomorrow. We start to demand it. We start to want it. We want things to be automated and delivered, and we want to get reminders and updates. We need to bear that in mind. That's how we all operate on a daily basis. And if we were all to be going into clinical trials, we would want to see the same type of approach. It would have to be delivered on our terms to some degree. So you've got to bear in mind that how do you want your clinical trial is the take-home message. So at that point, I'm going to stop and hand it back to Ryan, who I think is going to field the questions.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Stuart, for that insightful presentation. I'd like to invite our audience to continue sending their questions or comments right now using the questions window for this Q&A portion of the webinar. Now, I have already received some questions, so we will get started with those. Our very first question would like to know, what new technologies or tools are you considering in your solution offering?
I think from our perspective, I mean, we're focused on being able to push as much of the clinical trial into the community as we can, but with that package of care. So, you know, we're always looking at, well, what technology is coming out that allows our nurses to be able to do a wider range of assessments in the patient's home. So telehealth, we touched on, you know, and actually we're partnering with a number of telehealth organizations, because for us, when we look at a protocol and we say, well, we could do 6 out of the 20 visits with a nurse doing the blood draws or the IMP administration, but actually if we introduce a telehealth platform, we can do 12 because the physician's assessments can be brought into that visit, and I think that's critical for us in expanding the offering. But you know, as other technologies, when you look at whether it's wearables or whether it's portable ECGs that are hooked up to the internet and transmitting data, you know, any of those technologies that widen what we can offer and improve the way that data gets transmitted back centrally are important to widening our reach.
Excellent, thank you very much. Our next question then is asking if you can describe how you get patient feedback on your services.
That's quite interesting. I mean, we have done in the past some patient surveys to get general feedback. I think they've always shown that patients, you know, do value the service. They like being seen in the home. They like to build a relationship with the nurse. You know, it keeps them on the study. It keeps them on long-term studies, and it takes them from the main study into the extension because they're finding it a pleasant experience. I think recently we haven't done as many or as much. I think we regularly hear feedback from patients that anecdotally that, you know, they do really appreciate the service, and they like the fact that they can carry on with their lives, and it fits in with them. It doesn't work for everybody though. You have to balance it. So you know, my own personal example, you know, if it was a simple blood draw in the home, then I'd do it. If it was a long IMP infusion, I probably wouldn't. You know, it's the same from any patient's perspective. So, you know, there was one bit of feedback I heard that, you know, the patient chose to leave the home care service because actually when they went to the site and the visit was 20 minutes long, for example, because it was a simple blood draw. But when they did it in the home, it was an hour long because obviously the nurse has to process and centrifuge and package the samples afterwards. And it was easier for the patient to go to the site as they drove to work for that 20-minute stop off, because the hour-long visit meant they couldn't leave the house at the same time. So yeah, it's got to fit in for the individual. You know, yeah, but yeah, generally, patient feedback is great. It does allow patients to participate where otherwise they wouldn't, and it allows patients to stay in a study where otherwise they would absolutely drop out.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question then is curious if MRN is using your own eCRF platform, or do you employ some other providers?
We've historically been using electronic pen technology to collect the source data from the home. So we're about to launch a new eSource platform a little bit later this year, which is an in-sourced solution, which will completely automate all of our data. So straight into eSource platform on tablets.
All right, thank you. Next question is, what would you say is the optimal length for a home visit?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think it has to be a balance. I think it has to be a balance of the frequency of the visits, how much of it you can do in the home, and we do visits anything from an hour long to 8 hours long. So because we'll quite often get involved in in PK sampling that could be sitting at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 hours post dose. So those things are quite complex. And I think you've got to go out and you've got to get the feedback from the patients. I think early on up front, how would they react to that? But I would say most of our home visits are somewhere between an hour and 2 hours long, which is a reasonable amount of time to go in and do a blood draw and an IMP administration with all of the processing. I think if your visits get too long, then there's an invasion of privacy when you go into somebody's home. I think we probably all we'll all have experiences when you go, well, I've got the plumber coming around to do something in my bathroom, and the first thing you want to know is how long are you going to be here. I think there's I need the work doing, and I'm happy that you're here to do it, but how quickly can we get on with it? I think there's a balance. It'll be different for therapy areas and different demographics of people as well.
All right, thank you very much. Our next question then would like to know, what therapy areas do you work with most?
Pretty diverse, to be fair. I think we've dealt with most therapy areas. We do a lot of rare disease work. There are indications where patients are likely to be living a very long distance away from their treating physician and from the sites. So they lend themselves very well to pushing visits out into the home. Otherwise, you just wouldn't be able to get the patients in there into the studies. I would say the same of pediatrics. We do a lot of pediatric work because it's difficult and disruptive for the children and parents to be going into every single visit. But I think I think after that it's very, very broad ranging therapy areas. I think anything can be considered for moving out into a level of visits in the home, especially when you start thinking about the telehealth. So things in the past that we may have said, well, we can't do it, or we can't do enough of it to make a significant difference to the trial. The environment's changing now because we can start to use the technology to widen the offering.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question would like to know, is there a type of clinical trial that works best for DCT?
I think you've got to see the real benefit as a sponsor or a CRO of using a service to get the speed up and the retention. You need to be able to get a significant number of the visits out into the patient's home. So if you've got visits every 2 weeks for a year, and we can only do 3 in the home over the course of that time period, you're going to get very little benefit. And in fact, I would almost question the benefit of doing it at all. If you could put 70% of those visits out into the home, so you've got lots of very regular, frequent, simple visits, you get into a nice settled pattern very quickly. So if you're doing weekly IMP or weekly IMP and blood draws, once all the patients are enrolled and they're coupled with the nurses and they're rolling, you'll get really good recruitment, because the patients will pick it up. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it, and you'll get really good retention because of the frequencies. We get really good nurse retention because they build really good relationships, and it's consistent. So I would say high frequency, relatively simple visits would give you a really good return on investment.
All right, thank you. The next question then asks, have you seen an increase in studies since COVID pandemic hit?
Absolutely. I think the industry went into a sort of feeding frenzy in Q2 last year. So we saw a lot of new requests coming through, and a lot of expansion of our current ongoing trials, whether that was higher referrals coming through or widening the numbers of visits and the types of visits that the sponsors needed us to do. The regulators were quite understanding of the pandemic, so it was relatively simple to be able to say, well, if we'll waiver some of the assessments at these visits to be able to deliver the IMP into the home, because we've already got the service set up. So there was a lot of kind of change in scope and additional visits added on. We had to move to quite a strict triage system last year to accommodate the requests we were getting, because everybody wants a contingency plan, and you don't really get value out of a contingency plan if you need to implement it. Our perspective is always, if you're going to implement a service, you just implement it and use it anyway. You've got a built-in contingency, but if you're going to set it up, you should try and get the benefit and the return on investment, even if there isn't a second, third, or fourth wave of the pandemic. So I think the pandemic absolutely drove the number of customers and trials that we were getting involved in, and I think the whole sector, and that's what's really accelerated the whole DCT environment. I think coming off the back of the pandemic, as we're starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, although I think it's still very much up and down, and depending where you are on the globe. I don't think we're going to see a loss of interest around DCT models or taking home visits into clinical trials. I think it'll continue to grow because everybody's now tried something different and actually seeing that there is a different way of doing this, and then actually everybody is willing to change and look to the future, and not want to go back to where we were pre-pandemic.
All right, so then as a bit of a follow-up, do you think you've also seen an increase in sponsor requests versus CROs?
Yeah, and I think sponsors are starting. I mean, we've always probably had about a 50-50 mix of sponsor CRO work. I think all of the sponsors are showing a much bigger interest in the DCT models. It's becoming a much more of a focus. So I think there's a lot more direct interaction, I would say, than there maybe was 2 years ago. I think it was already happening. I think the pandemic accelerated it. And for MRN, we're global and we're independent. So I think we sit in a different place to some of our competitors that are out there that now are being bought up and merged in with some of the CROs. So we're sitting in a different place. So yeah, the environment's changing. Everybody's starting to structure around DCT now and focus on delivering it and doing it. And I think that's that comes back to what I was talking about that. How do you deploy it? How do you plan it into the study effectively? So I think that has to start at the sponsors, not the CROs.
All right, well, thank you very much for that answer, and for all of the answers and your time today. However, we have reached the end of the Q&A portion of the webinar. Now, if we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at MRN may follow up with you, or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email address that's up on your screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I'm also about to send you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll be able to view a recording of this event on this page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me in thanking our speaker once more, Stuart Redding, and we hope you all found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for coming.